your local election headquarters. A debate with Democratic candidates for the 1st Massachusetts Congressional District, live from the 22 News Studios.
Good afternoon and welcome to a special Your Election Headquarters program. I'm Rich Teddemer. Today, 22 News is hosting a debate between the candidates who are running for the Democratic nomination in the 1st Congressional District of Massachusetts. And joining me in studio today is incumbent Congressman Richard Neal and challenger attorney Tahira Amatul-Wadood. Both candidates will begin with 1 minute of opening statements, and by virtue of the coin toss, Tahira Amatul-Wadood, you will go first.
Thank you, Rich. Thanks for having me. Good afternoon. Good afternoon, Congressman. And to the people of Western Massachusetts, I am so excited to be here running this race on the issues. My name is Tahira Amatul-Wadood. I live in Springfield. I've been here since I was 9 years old. I am an attorney. I've had the honor and the pleasure of serving families in some of their darkest, most vulnerable moments. My job has been to assist families in reconstructing their lives, sometimes with the death of a loved one or divorce, custody, support, visitation. Those are the issues that impact families here, and the job that I do helps to deliver them through it. I am running this race because I have noticed that there's been an absence of moral leadership and of being able to advance policy that meets our families. I am very, very excited to have met so many of you along the campaign trail. I support policies that will deliver us to success and victory, not only for the 1st District, but throughout our country.
Congressman Neal, your opening statement, please.
Thanks, Rich, and thanks to the attorney as well. And thanks to Channel 22 for providing this opportunity to have a discussion of the issues that confront the voters of Central and Western Massachusetts as we proceed to what has been a very chaotic time in Washington. I'm very proud of the record that I've established during the course of this career. It's been marked by pursuing the Affordable Care Act, which I helped to write in the Ways and Means Committee, a rigorous defense of Social Security and Medicare, projects big and small, but always emphasizing jobs and opportunity and aspirations for members of the American family. What I think is significant at this juncture in our time is the issue of how facts play out. And I hope during the course of this next half hour, we'll have a chance to discuss in a fact-based manner many of the issues that I've just noticed. But again, Social Security, Medicare, health care, decent schools, opportunities for all members of the American family. And I think that the course that I have taken during this career has been consistent with the principles I've just outlined.
Thank you, Congressman Neal, and thank you, candidates, for your opening statements. Now we move on to the question and answer portion of our debate. I will ask a question about policy issues for both candidates. Each candidate will have 1 minute to respond to the question. We're going to hold you to that minute, too. So if you get close to that minute or go over that minute, I'll have to tell each candidate to stop, that they've reached that time limit. We've determined the order of questions through a coin toss, and by virtue of that coin toss, Congressman Neal will answer first, and after the first question, the order of responses will alternate. We'll have a lot of issues to cover today in this half hour, so let's get started. We begin with our first question to Congressman Neal, and that first question is: Democrats are hoping to regain control of the House and perhaps the Senate in November. If this happens, what would you like to be the top priorities of a Democratic Congress?
Well, I think there are a series of issues, including continuing to defend and support the Affordable Care Act, which I helped to write. I think the Ways and Means Committee has a particular responsibility. If we win the majority, that would put me in a key position for that very purpose. I'm delighted that we were able to announce last night the support of John Lewis, my longstanding colleague on the Ways and Means Committee, in addition to which the defense of Social Security and Medicare, which are part of the portfolio of the Ways and Means Committee, but also to talk about the problem that America has with pensions and retirement savings. I also believe that there's a chance here to expand Medicaid for members of the American family. We can take some personal satisfaction right here today in Chicopee, Massachusetts, that 100% of the children in Massachusetts are covered with health care, and 97% of the adults are covered with health care. So I hope during the course of this conversation, we'll be able to talk about those issues as they relate to the issues I've just described, understanding that the Ways and Means Committee has primary responsibility for many of these functions.
Thank you, Congressman. Attorney, would you like me to ask the question again? Would you like just to respond?
No, I got it. So when I'm on the doors and I'm meeting the voters right where they are, what I'm hearing is that voters are deeply concerned about not only economic prosperity, but the availability of solid health care options, be able to control the cost of pharmaceuticals, and access to strong infrastructure, namely how we deal with access to internet and affordable internet. So the policies that I'd be supporting would address all of those in a very ambitious and aggressive and yet achievable way. I'd get in and I'd co-sponsor 676, Medicare for All. My opponent does not support Medicare for All. I would support trying to assist and strengthen the Affordable Care Act, but that's just the wrong fight at this point. It's embattled, it probably won't be here long, so we have to get around a policy like Medicare for All. Lloyd Doggett introduced a bill that would help control costs around pharmaceuticals. I'd support that. I'd support the Jobs and Justice Act. There are many things that we can do with leadership that is accountable to the people, and we'll get it done.
Let's talk about that with our next question now.
Yes.
Senator Bernie Sanders is among those who support Medicare for All plan, and you said that you would back that effort. But if so, how would you think that the government could pay for that?
There are a number of ways that we can pay for it. First, we have to value the fact that this is something worth paying for. And when the American people decide that this is important, and we're polling on it, and it indicates that it is, Medicare for All is a favored option as a divorce attorney whose job it is to make sure that families have their health insurance intact, I recognize it is very important, so we value it. One, we have to claw back and repatriate some of the offshore tax shelter monies, over $2 trillion just waiting to be repatriated and brought back into the American budget and the American fisc. We would give the defense bill a little bit of a haircut. It's a bloated budget. My opponent voted for it. There's lots of waste there. The only ones that are actually winning from that budget are the industry, the defense industry lobby, and we'd deal with that in a way that keeps our men and women safe and our national security at the highest priority.
Attorney Amital Wadud says that you do not support Medicare for All. Tell us about that.
I am not opposed to Medicare for All. My argument has been that in the current controversy that we have, shouldn't we be better off making sure that the Affordable Care Act is extended? It's one of the signature accomplishments of the Obama administration, and we worked hard to get that done. 20 million more Americans have health insurance today because of the Affordable Care Act, and by and large, making sure that pre-existing condition is eliminated, making sure that 26-year-olds can stay on their parents' health insurance, and putting a cap on out-of-pocket expenses. All of those are critical. And let me speak to Ms. Wadud's commentary on the defense budget. Senator Kennedy voted for that defense budget. We have a commercial opportunity at Westover and a commercial opportunity at Barnes, as well as the fact that 7,200 people get up and go to work there every single day. John Olver worked with me on Westover, and I worked with him on Barnes during those years. We also, I think, when you consider the idea of extending health care to all members of the American family, that should be the game and goal of all of us at this particular time. That is a desirable outcome, and I want that to happen. But it's important to understand that we need to discuss how best to get there.
Let's talk about the next question then. The United States spends more money on its military than any other country in the world. Overall, do you think that the U.S. spends responsibly on defense? And what, if anything, you would change? Well,
there have to be some changes. You know, this idea that I have voted for all of the defense budgets over the years is not true. There have been times when I've opposed them when I thought that they were bloated. In this particular instance, I'm proud of the fact that we were able to insert an additional $42 million into Westover Air Force Base. I think it's the largest air base in America. In addition, Barnes has a very important commercial opportunity when you consider what takes place there every single day, but not to miss the point that it's a huge part of the economic structure of Western Massachusetts. You know, when you consider the Westover, what they have there with the C5s and the opportunity for growth on the commercial side as well, we should be, I think, as Kennedy noted, and I've noted over the years, and John Olver has noted over the years, that making sure those bases function the way they're supposed to is an important consideration. By the way, part of your responsibility for being a member of Congress.
Attorney, what do you think about the United States military spending, and if you would have anything to do, what would you change about it?
My highest priority is in keeping our national security at the highest level. I have family members, friends, clients who are members of the military, and I would make sure that they have everything they need to take care of themselves and their families and to defend our country. But I'm deeply concerned that when we look at budgets such as what my opponent has just signed, we recognize that defense contractors are big donors to his his campaign fund. He's received over $300,000 from them. Many of these defense contractors have been sanctioned for non-compliance and fraud. It is a waste. I'm deeply concerned that Westover Air Force Base stays here and stays vibrant, and that Barnes stays here and stays vibrant. I appreciate the energy and the important work that they do. I've been in touch with members and residents in Westfield who are concerned about the issue about water. There's been no moral leadership to get ahead of the contaminated water there. So again, where is the opportunity to hold town hall meetings and to speak with residents about what they really want and not what's being imposed upon them?
Let's talk about a subject that has touched so many lives here, and it's the opioid epidemic. And it has claimed many lives here and across the country. What can be done in Congress to improve treatment and prevent more deaths?
The primary issue that I feel is important is not just looking at the opioid crisis, but that we have to look at addiction in a broad capacity. I have, again, friends, clients, neighbors whose children have succumbed to fatal overdoses. For me, this is real and this is close to home. The difference I would suggest between me and my opponent is that we have to have a different conversation, different priorities around how we deal with addiction. There is deep disparity in how addiction is manifested when it's housed in the body of a person of color, black and brown community member, a person who lives far away from treatment plans in hospitals versus people who have resources and insurance. And until we acknowledge that there's deep disparity in how addiction is treated, we will not be able to solve the opioid crisis. I promise you that much.
Let's talk about the opioid crisis here.
Just a quick previous comment based on the notion that somehow that my defense vote was based upon support for war. There aren't many members of Congress that can say that not only did they vote against the war in Iraq, but got up on the House floor and took a position that was contrary to public opinion at the time. Now, opiates. Every one of us today, whether it's here at Channel 22, those in our neighborhoods, the communities that are nearby, across this Commonwealth and across America, they know somebody who's addicted. They know somebody, whether it's a family or a friend or somebody who lives down the street who has the addiction. Just before Congress adjourned, 2 pieces of legislation that I offered on Medicare and opiate addiction both passed the House of Representatives, including the STOP Act, including providing Medicare benefit to people 65 and over who become addicted. But there's another consideration as well. Before anybody else was talking and doing about this, in Holyoke, Massachusetts, almost 5 years ago, Ed Markey and I were talking about what to do here. 2 million people who are addicted in America, that is unacceptable for all of us. More beds, treating it as a mental health disease, and get people back on their feet.
Time is up. That's a question we could talk about for the next hour about the opioid epidemic. Here's a topic that I know well about, student debt. I have one son out of college, one daughter in college, and one about to start college. Student debt is a major concern for many people here in Western Massachusetts. What can Congress do to reduce the burden of student debt and make college more affordable?
Well, I think there could continue to be more emphasis on vocational education, apprenticeship programs, experimenting with the idea of making our community college more debt-free, and also understanding that in a lot of ways the problem that we face with public education in many of our states is that the taxpayer no longer provides the kind of support that they once did for state universities and colleges. I have brought back millions of dollars to these colleges and universities. I understand fully, having sent 4 kids to college, what debt means, and I took the position of taking a second job and trying to make sure that they were able to get through college. I served on the Board of Trustees at Mount Holyoke for 10 years. I understand fully what this means. So I also think some debt forgiveness based upon what we might choose in a career would continue to make a good deal of sense. And if you would note that New York just recently provided debt relief to those in medical school, I think those are examples of which we can build upon. Now, I've heard the argument about free college. I understand it. We should be cutting costs and all of that. But I have not been convinced yet that very wealthy people ought to have free college.
Attorney Amatul Wadud, college debt, the student debt. How can we make college more affordable and help out kids with that debt?
So I'm 44 years old and I still have student loan debt. I have a child who's almost 25 years old, and fortunately he was a great basketball player in high school, so he went to school without having to incur debt. He had a full scholarship. I have a 20-year-old who's attending Westfield State University. So what our family is looking at right now is generational student loan debt. It's very, very real, and it disproportionately impacts poor families and families of color. So one, we have to recognize that that is the case. Again, we have to name these problems and then organize and legislate around solving them. So in addition to what my opponent has suggested in terms of walking back costs for college, I would also suggest that college loans be not only forgiven, but also interest-free, and that the government should not be able to profit off of the backs of poor and working class Americans who are just trying to secure educations for themselves and their children.
Let's talk minimum wage here. Federal minimum wage has not increased since 2009. There has been a movement, though, to raise the minimum wage to $15 an hour. Would you support a $15 federal minimum wage, or at what other level would you find appropriate?
I would support a $15 increase to the minimum wage on a federal level. It's very important. And I think what also happens is that not only would families be able to afford to live, which right now we're really struggling, our district itself, dead last in median income of the 9 congressional districts, higher than average rate of poverty. So in our district, we have a vested interest in making sure that people are raised to a standard where they can actually live. And so legislating to get there is important, but demonstrating that I understand and I live in proximity to the people who are suffering the most will help me lead them successfully, and I'm looking forward to it.
Congressman Neal, your thoughts on minimum wage?
I have voted for every minimum wage increase during my years in Congress, and I certainly support the idea of the $15 minimum wage, and I think applause goes to the governor and to the state legislature for the manner in which they've taken us there. In addition to that notion and argument and discussion about median income, the 1st Congressional District has a higher median income than the rest of America. The unemployment rate in the 1st Congressional District is 1.1% less than the national unemployment rate. In addition to which, the fastest growing median income for many districts around this country happens to be in the 1st District. So whether it was Ted Kennedy and John Olver, Jim McGovern, or all of us, Elizabeth Warren, we've worked very hard to make sure that there's been significant growth here. And at the moment, the job picture continues to be one that keeps getting better.
Can I address that?
You can in this next comment when you have a chance. First, the next question goes to Congressman Neal, and it's about gun control. It's a highly debated issue, of course, nationwide, but little has been done on the federal level. What kind of gun control measures would you support, and what realistically can be done over the next 2 years?
Well, I hope that the 10-point plan that I outlined in the Berkshire Eagle would be part of the consideration. Mental health background checks, red flag, people who are involved in domestic abuse can't get a gun. Those who have a history of mental health problems can't get weaponry. But I also voted for the assault weapons ban in the crime bill in 1994. Ms. Wadood was a bit wobbly when she was asked about gun measures in a forum in Pittsfield, Massachusetts. My position has been consistent, whether it was the Saturday night special, whether it was the concealed handgun, whether it was the assault weapons ban. Reasonable gun control measures, I think, could have gone a long way toward preventing what has happened in Parkland, Sandy Hook, or in Colorado. I think taking that into consideration is a very important matter. My position on gun measures has been entirely consistent.
Attorney Amatul Wadood, you want to address minimum wage or gun control?
Let's address minimum wage, and let's say that my opponent actually deflected and started comparing the Western District or the 1st Congressional District in Western Massachusetts statistics to the national statistics. I'm keeping it here, and I'm comparing it to how we're doing in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. I just want to make sure that we are comparing apples to apples. With respect to gun control measures, let me be clear, there's been no wobbly on what I've proposed. I propose raising the minimum, the wage, the age limit. I propose thorough background checks. As a divorce lawyer who deals primarily with folks who are involved in domestic violence, I recognize the importance of securing guns and keeping communities safe. I also would suggest that we fund the CDC to conduct research and remove barriers to allowing that research to be shared and acted upon, and I've not heard my opponent discuss that.
Obviously, as a congresswoman or congressman, you'll be in Washington and you'll deal with national issues as well. And here's another national issue. President Trump has promised not to support any immigration reform package that does not include funding for a border wall. Would you, under any circumstances, vote for an immigration reform package that contains funding for a border wall?
No. No, absolutely not. We need to deliver our neighbors here a Clean Dream Act. We need to get control of what is happening at the border. And the idea that the atrocities that are happening at the border are new, that is a myth. These things have been happening for a very long time. I've spent the last 2 years discussing immigration reform, discussing and educating folks on policies that adversely impact immigrants. I would be suggesting that we recognize that part of keeping ourselves safe and protecting our national security is to honor and respect each and every person that comes into contact with our border. And I would work very, very hard to always promote the spirit of democracy and the spirit of human rights with everyone that we contact.
Congressman Neal, your thoughts
The president's
on that?
position is irresponsible as it relates to the border wall. I actually visited with those families at the border. I met Sister Norma. I traveled with her. I heard her plea. The idea that we would separate families against their will is outrageous. The president has not given leadership on the issue of immigration. I have in the past voted for immigration bills in Congress that have been responsible. And I think immigration reform would go a long way toward being supportive of the measures I've just outlined. But Barack Obama got it right when he said, register and get in line. We need to know who's coming across the border, and that can be accomplished through an immigration reform bill. The president's position as recently as yesterday, when he suggested that he will veto spending bills if they don't include money for the border wall, strikes me as being ill-considered and certainly unwarranted. But immigration reform is a part of American history. I know something about that. I had immigrant grandparents. And while the story is inconsistent throughout our history, I don't remember families being separated at the border.
Next question is to you, Congressman Neal. The United States has the largest prison population in the world. Do you think that the American justice system incarcerates too many people? And what kinds of criminal justice reforms would you like to see?
It does incarcerate too many people, particularly those from marginalized communities. There are more than 2 million people in prison today in America. And I think that part of the challenge that we have in front of us is to redo sentencing guidelines, to come to a better conclusion how we might get people back into the mainstream of economic life. But if you talk to Mike Ash, the former sheriff of Hampden County, one of the things that he would always point out as it related to the inmates and a profile of those inmates at the Hampden County facility, 90% of those inmates have drug or alcohol problems. And jail is not the best way to treat drug and alcohol problems, nor is it the best way to treat those who have mental health challenges. So I think that we have talked about it. The Senate has actually moved forward. The House has been more intransigent on the issue. But I think that sentencing reform makes a good deal of sense. And speaking to those who have been marginalized from marginalized communities would be a good starting point in that conversation.
Attorney Amatul Wadud, do you think our justice system incarcerates too many people, and what can be done to alleviate that?
Oh, it certainly incarcerates too many people. That's why I support the legalization of marijuana, because too many folks are being criminalized who otherwise should not be. I support addressing mandatory minimums and giving judges the discretion to invoke sentencing in a more flexible way. That's very important. I support CORI reform, especially on the statewide basis. That's important to allowing people to avoid recidivism and to secure employment and housing, which right now with certain criminal histories in their background, it makes it more difficult. We want to make sure that folks are accountable and they have quality of lives as they leave the state of incarceration to come back into society. I would also suggest that we eliminate cash bail. It's very important as well.
Okay, we're coming up to the midterm elections, and this is much anticipated. So no matter which party wins control of Congress in November, they will have to work with the Trump administration. Are there areas of policy that you can see yourself working with the Trump administration? Most
certainly. As a lawyer, I know how to litigate, I know how to fight, I know how to advocate on behalf of clients as if their lives depend on it. And the climate that we're in here in this country and in the First District requires that level of tenacity, that vision, that energy, that fresh blood. I also recognize that if I have to take something to a trial because there's a fundamental disagreement between my client and the other party, I am fully capable of doing that. But I am also a conciliator. I also know how to come across the table and reach agreement with parties around where commonality serves us. And that's exactly how I will lead this district and serve this district as a Congresswoman. I recognize that where there are policy issues that work for the 1st District, no matter who's advancing them, I will sit and work with them to get it done. And I have a history of being able to conciliate just that way.
Congressman Neal, do you see yourself working with the Trump administration or finding any common ground?
Infrastructure and pension reform. I've been chosen to sit on what is known as a super committee by the Democratic leadership. There are only a handful of us on it. I'm the lead Democrat in the House. I think there's an opportunity to address what is now a fledgling problem across America, and that is the failure of more of our pension systems. Right now, in the Central States labor issues, whether it's the Teamsters or the mine workers or those who are not unionized, they all have a serious problem going into the end of the year. I have received the support of the Teamsters and the mine workers and others, as well as many of the unions, including the state AFL-CIO, in an effort to address, I think, many of these problems that these pension systems are about to have. Nothing would jack up and boost the American economy more quickly right now than a good, healthy investment in infrastructure. Our highways, our bridges, our airports, our railroads. And by the way, the rail transportation from New Haven to Hartford to Springfield is part of what stimulus did. I sponsored that legislation, got up and spoke in support of it, and I think it was one of President Obama's better achievements.
Now it's time for closing statements from our candidates. Each candidate will have 1 minute to make that closing statement. And again, the order of these closing statements was established through a coin toss, and Congressman Neal will make the first closing statement.
First, Rich, thanks to you again, and thanks to Channel 22, and thanks to Ms. Wadood for being here. I've had an opportunity to represent this district for a considerable period of time, but the achievements that we've brought together have been pretty remarkable, big and small, but always a defense of Social Security, always a defense of Medicare, always a defense of the idea that we can do big projects together. Whether it's the use of new markets tax credits, the historic tax credit, or support for the low-income housing tax credit. Whether it's to discuss repatriated income that sits overseas. Whether it's to address the complexities of the American tax code, but always to understand that we do this together. I've been an advocate for the working families of this district for all of these years. I have time and again stood with you through good times and bad times in an effort to make sure that you and your work counts. I hope on September 4th that once again I can respectfully ask for and count on your vote. And thank you all very much.
Attorney Amatul Wadood, your closing statement, please.
Thank you, Rich. Thank you, Congressman, and thank you to the people of the 1st District. Again, it's been my complete honor to have gotten a chance to know as many of you as I've had for the past 8 months that we've been in this race. It has been my complete honor to grow up in Springfield and to live in close proximity and to grow and love this community. I will serve this community with the highest level of attention, of care. There will never be a divided loyalty between the needs of the people and my funders. I support programs like Medicare for All. I support programs that will control medical costs and pharmaceutical costs. I met a woman recently who complained that she's paying $800 a month for her type 1 diabetes insulin. My own parents figure out that they have to spend $300 a month for my mother's long-lasting inhaler. The Congressman has not shown leadership in ways that would gain control over these costs, is not looking out for the people of the 1st District. I always will, and I respectfully request your vote on September 4th.
Candidates, that's all the time we have for this Your Election Headquarters debate. We'd like to thank Attorney Tahir Amatul Wadood and Congressman Richard Neal for participating. If you missed any of this debate, it'll be posted in its entirety on our website at wwlp.com. The Massachusetts State Primary is Tuesday, September 4th. Be sure to go out and make your voice heard. I'm Rich Teddemer. Have a good afternoon.